Peter Tatchell, thank you for talking to us. Can you tell us a little bit about your memories of your first Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras?
My first Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras was in 1987. In fact, I'd been in Australia in 1978, but just missed that first one by a couple of weeks because I'd already arranged to leave to return to England. So 1987 was my first. It was such a contrast to the Pride parades in Britain, which didn't have the razzmatazz, the floats, the spectacle of Sydney. I was incredibly impressed by all the floats, marching bands and walking groups. In particular, what stuck in my mind was the really fantastic Asian floats and walking groups, which were really spectacular in their extravagance and colour and verve. I think in that year the parade went out to the Fox Studios, where there was this huge post-parade all-night party, which again was like nothing we'd ever had in Britain. To have thousands and thousands of people. I'd never been to an LGBT party like it.
You were an organiser of the first London Pride Parade in 1972. Were you aware of the history of the organisation of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras in 1978? Or did you know any of those 78ers who were at that parade?
Well, of course, I was a very good friend of Brian McGahan, who was in the 78 protest, and I think he was one of the organisers, or certainly one of the key participants. I'd met Brian in communist East Germany in 1973. We were there for the World Festival of Youth and Students, and I was the only gay liberation delegate. Brian was a delegate from the Australian Communist Party, but openly gay, and at that time the Australian Communist Party had passed a very progressive gay rights resolution. So after we parted, I kept in touch with him, and in fact ended up staying with him in 78 when I was there in Australia, but unfortunately just before that first ever Mardi Gras parade, which was so violently broken up by the police.
When did you first become aware of that police violence?
It wasn't until a few weeks later, when it was reported in the LGBT press here in Britain, that I became aware of the police assault on the parade in 78. And I was truly horrified. You know, in that era, you know, Australia seemed to be becoming more progressive and more open to LGBT rights. So to have this violent police assault upon an entirely peaceable Pride parade or Mardi Gras just struck me as totally bizarre and, of course, totally unacceptable.
You've been to Mardi Gras parades since. How have they changed, do you think?
I think certainly, like Pride parades around the world, they have become more commercial. There is still a political dimension, but it's probably not as strong as in the past, and certainly not as strong as in 1978.
You've marched a lot in the London Pride marches and parades, and Sydney Mardi Gras you've been to. You've talked earlier about the differences. What are the similarities between the two?
I think the similarities across Pride parades in all Western capitals is very much that there has been a dumbing down of the politics. They're not as political and human rights focused as they once were. In addition, I'd say there's a much greater profile for businesses and corporates, much more so than in the past. I accept there needs to be some kind of, you know, corporate funding to help put the event on, but my concern is that in some cases the corporates seem to be taking over, and that their message and their profile swamps that of community groups. And after all, Pride grew out of community, and it's really important that the Pride ethos of the struggle for LGBT human rights is at the forefront and remains at the forefront.
Do you think both parades and organisers can learn from each other?
Certainly, I think that, you know, we could perhaps learn from Pride organisers and parades in less open liberal societies, where they still very much have a political human rights cutting edge. So in Moscow or Kampala, You know, the Pride parades there are very much about the right of LGBT people to be and the claim for equal civil rights. I think we need to never lose sight of the fact that our human rights have involved huge progress in the decades that have passed, but there are still issues in Australia, in Britain and many other countries. There are still issues that have yet to be won. You know, the basic ideas, you know, basic principles, like in Northern Ireland, there's still, as we speak, a ban on same-sex marriage, as there is in Australia. You know, in most Western countries still, there isn't adequate sex and relationship education in schools that includes LGBT issues. And there are no equality and diversity lessons that teach and educate young people against homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. Plus, of course, we know that even in the most progressive Western countries, there are still anti-LGBT hate crimes. So there's work still to be done. And in particular, we need to remember the people around the world who live under oppressive homophobic regimes in 73 countries where homosexuality is still a criminal offence. And half of those countries, or nearly half, criminalise both male and female homosexuality. 36 of those countries are members of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is 52 member states. 36 of its member states still have a total prohibition on same-sex relations, with penalties ranging up to life imprisonment and even the possibility of execution in parts of Pakistan and Nigeria under Sharia law. So the global struggle for LGBT freedom is far from won, and I think that needs to be part of pride parades and festivals in Western countries. We can't have this Eurocentric focus on LGBT rights. We need to open out to the global perspective and recognise that until every LGBT person on this planet has freedom, the battle continues.
So do you think there'll always be a place for these parades?
But of course, Pride evolved or came into existence as an affirmation of LGBT people and communities in homophobic societies. It was because we were told to feel shame that we responded with LGBT pride. Now, of course, as we move towards a more inclusive, accepting society, where homophobia, biphobia and transphobia are radically diminished, then perhaps the need for pride parades will be less than in the past. But that, I think, is some years away yet. I think, you know, there is still much work to be done, even in, you know, liberal Western societies, to challenge the degree of prejudice that our communities face. And as long as that is the case, we will need pride. We also need to recognise that, of course, not all LGBT people are on a level playing field. Here in Britain, if you're from the African communities or the Muslim communities, you will face much greater discrimination and rejection within your communities than if you're a middle-class white man. So it's much more difficult for LGBT Muslims and Africans to come out. And just at London's Pride Parade this year, 2017, we had a young Bengali guy of Muslim heritage who had only just come out in his 30s, and he was very fearful of the reaction within his community. We know of many others who have faced great, not only rejection by their family, community and mosque, but also violent physical threats against them. And in some cases, we know of LGBT Muslim people in London, a supposedly liberal open city, where LGBT Muslims are being forced out of their homes by Islamist extremist mobs. So we've got to recognise that there are some sections of our community that are still really struggling. And every year, there are thousands of people who turn up at Pride for the very first time, having just finally come to accept their sexuality. Just yesterday, I met a guy from the African Caribbean community. It was his first Pride event. He was 37 years old, the first time he'd ever been to Pride. So for lots of people, Pride is a really special moment. A special moment where they can join a community, where they can come out, where they can affirm who they are. So as long as that's the case, we still need Pride.
Do you think you will ever attend the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras again?
I hope so. My last Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras was in 2010, when I was invited to speak at the Allied Conference. I was in the parade on one of the floats, and I had a placard which mocked the then Pope Benedict XVI. I had a big blown up image of him with lipstick, a beauty spot, earrings and eyeshadow, mocking his heterosexual and masculine pretensions, labelling him as Pope Betty, Queen of Homophobia. I like to mock homophobes. I like to drag them down a peg or two. I think satire and comedy is a very useful way of doing that. I think, you know, screaming hate at homophobes doesn't really work. That's their game. We're just playing into their hands. But I think ridiculing them and satirising them is a much more effective way to debunk their homophobia.
Couple of quick questions. One of the messages I often get from some of those who were at the first Mardi Gras in 1978 was the message was about liberation, queer, gay liberation. Often we see placards calling for equality. Do you think liberation and equality can work side by side, or are we all becoming assimilated?
In the early days of the London Gay Liberation Front, which I was involved in from 1971 when I came from Australia, the word equality never passed our lips. Our agenda was about liberation, about transforming society to liberate LGBT people and to also liberate straight people, because we were aiming for a new sexual democracy, to banish erotophobia and sex shame, to banish prejudice against LGBT people, and to create a new sexual democracy where everyone could be who they want to be, where the labels LGBT and straight no longer would have significance. And we also saw this as part of a much bigger project to liberate women, black people, working class people and others who'd been marginalised and excluded. So our agenda was very much about social transformation rather than integration and acceptance within the status quo. We were critical of what was, we wanted something different, and we allied with others in society to help make that possible. So we supported the black liberation struggle, we supported the battle for women's rights, and we supported trade unions and working class people in their struggle for social justice.
So do you see a lot of parallels with campaigns here in the UK and campaigns in Australia?
I think the trajectories are a bit different. You know, we have won marriage equality. You're still fighting for it. And I've got to say that actually the Australian campaign for marriage equality is probably the best in the world. It's been so imaginative, with such incredible determination and perseverance. The tragedy is that you've had two successive intransigent governments who just haven't listened. But you've won the battle for public opinion years and years and years ago. And I really do think that the Australian campaign for equal marriage has been the best in the world. And I think it's a real template for other activists in other countries to follow.
And finally, 2018 will be the 40th anniversary of the first Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. What are your hopes for that Mardi Gras? Or any advice you'd give to the organisers?
I think it's really important that Pride and Mardi Gras events around the world go back to their roots. That they turn the clock back a bit to revive the ethos of those early first Pride and Mardi Gras parades. To put human rights for LGBT people fair, square and centre of the events. To commemorate the veterans, the people who began it, many of whom are forgotten or unknown or unsung. To recognise that if it hadn't been for those early pioneers, many of the gains that we've won may not have happened, or certainly would have taken much longer. So we owe a real debt to the pioneers, to the veterans of 78. We need to celebrate and salute them. They are our heroes and heroines. They are the people who began this awesome struggle for LGBT freedom.
Peter Tatchell, thank you very much.
Thank you.